We start with this headline development. The Khampepe Commission of Inquiry looking into the tragic Usindiso building fire in Johannesburg has released the first part of its report. The commission has found that action should be taken against the CEO of the city's property company, that's Helen Botes. This decisive stance comes after the commission's finding held that the City of Johannesburg and its entities should be held liable or accountable for the deaths of 77 people who died in that fire that took place in August last year, with numerous others suffering injuries and displacement. Yesterday, Justice Sisi Khampepe released the long-awaited report following extensive hearings. It underscored the city violated its own bylaws. Beyond that, it recommended that the city conduct an internal inquiry to identify those responsible for neglecting their duties, which ultimately contributed to the devastating fire. Let's unpack the findings of this report, get you some reaction if you like. Bring in our guest, the president of the General Industries Workers of South Africa, or Workers Union of South Africa. That's Mametlwe Sebei, who joins us now via our video link. Great to have you on the program, sir. Thanks very much indeed for making time. The report itself, of course, was read in part yesterday, and I wonder what your initial response to this is, given how much coverage this tragedy has received and how long the inquiry took to put together its findings.
We most certainly welcome the report. We welcome the report, and we think that the most important outcome of this investigation is a complete vindication of our position. From the beginning, we've always insisted that the city is responsible, and I think the Commission, in its finding, did conclude that it is a violation of the city's own bylaws and the criminal neglect of the building, and I think a similar building that is ultimately responsible and cause of the tragedy that cost so many lives, 76 of them, many more injured, and of course a loss of property. We think that this, in a sense, does vindicate our position. There are also things that we welcomed in the report. One is also the fact that those responsible within relevant lines of department need to be held accountable through a disciplinary process. But we do also say that that doesn't go far enough. This is a case of a criminal abdication of responsibility, and I think there is a need for a criminal prosecution, not only of the person responsible for the assets and those that aided and abetted him in that, but also within the city itself. There is a criminal liability, we think, but also we think that the report could have done and addressed a number of issues, and in respect of that is having a shortfall.
Right, and we'll speak about that in a moment. As a start, I was hoping to just gauge how confident you are that anybody will be held responsible ultimately, because sadly, we live in a country where inquiries are held, money is spent, reports are put together, recommendations are tabled, and sadly, nothing ever follows after that.
True, we have absolutely no illusions in the elite within the city. If anything, their reaction and the cruel and inhumane manner in which they continue to treat the survivors of that fire does tell you that these are not people that believe they have an obligation towards the victims of that tragedy, towards the survivors, but also that they are in any way responsible and accountable for what actually happened. Therefore, it is incumbent on us to intensify our program of actions. You would know we've had several demonstrations, 2 mass demonstrations in the inner city of Johannesburg, directed at the city, directed at the Premier's office. We've held regular pickets, at the commission. We have made sure that the survivors are actually picking, the audience, or rather, they participate fully in the commission, because we refuse to agree that 76 poor black working class people can die in such a tragic manner and nobody's accountable. So on our part, we have no illusions, but also we know that on the basis of concerted and relentless action, we are going to ensure that there is accountability and action is taken.
Yeah, you speak about the report not addressing some of the concerns that you had. I wonder what those are, because part of what the city has always said is that they find themselves between a rock and a hard place. Every time there's an attempt to remove people from these hijacked buildings, there's court orders against them, with part of the laws being cited preventing them from doing exactly that. I wonder to what extent this particular inquiry ventilated that conundrum. Well,
as you correctly pointed out, this is only first part of the report. There is a second part of the commission that took place, which is dealing with the broad issues, including issues of housing. But we do think that, as you have said, there could have been a recommendation for a criminal prosecution of certain relevant officials within the City of Johannesburg, most certainly. We do think that the report is failing to address the manner in which the survivors continue to be treated in so-called emergency relocation sites, including Denver. You would know that Denver settlement, for instance, experienced repeated disasters, particularly in the form of floods since December. And that means victims and survivors of that fire are reliving the trauma of the tragedy that actually befell them. And I think also just the cruel and inhuman manner in which the migrants, who were also, some of whom are part of the survivors, are being treated, just reflect the way in which the city and of course the government at large is approaching this tragedy. You would know, not only are they not accommodated at Denver and other location sites where only South Africans are located, the migrants are, as we are speaking, in detention, facing evictions, and all sorts of harassment from the police, including deportations. This is not the way that you treat people who are victims and who have survived such a massive trauma. There's also nothing that has been said about compensation of these victims. You would know that not only people have lost, breadwinners in that fire, but even the survivors themselves have, sustained injuries, but also loss of mega property, which may seem nothing to I and you, but the reality is that these are people in low-paid jobs, these are people in informal trading, these are people that are unemployed and therefore have nothing to their name except what they lost in that fire. If they are to rebuild their lives, this has to be compensated fully, and we do think that the Commission has failed in that respect.
Yeah. Is there any kind of compassion from your end, Mametlwe, around the kind of difficult position that the city might find itself in? I mean, on the one hand, if the city allows people to continue taking ownership or living in these hijacked properties, they will still be held accountable for not moving them to safer areas. But if they try to move them, there's always going to be a discussion about whether the relocated site is in fact habitable enough. Part of the city's argument, for example, is that they don't have the means to place anybody who lives in these buildings in, comfortable, safe places. And I suppose there's going to be questions about if there is enough political will to see this through, but is there at least an appreciation of that difficulty at the very least?
There are two issues there. One is that I don't think that if the city wanted to address this problem, it can't find a common ground with many disparate people occupying these and similar buildings, which are estimated at 224 according to the city. Many of these people do not appreciate the conditions in which they are staying, which are conditions of squalor and degradation, not compatible with human dignity. And if the city wants to upgrade these buildings, it can be done. There is no will on that. So it's not true that any of our organizations, including human rights organizations that actually organizes and of course fight for the justice, including the right to housing of these occupants, are actually opposed to any upgrading. That can be done. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think this speaks to the broad crisis of housing in the inner city. Now, let's speak to the facts here. You see, the city has a housing backlog of 500,000 units. It built 2,500 units a year. That means it will take them 200 years just to resolve the current housing backlog. Not to mention the fact that this is a city which, given the levels of underdevelopment in rural areas, people are forced from the rest of the country to be migrating to in search of jobs, in search of means of livelihood, in search of services. I mean, I met UJ students that are staying in these buildings to my shock. right? I have some students that are also enrolled in colleges, to my shock, that are staying in these kind of conditions. And the reality is that there is no accommodation for the students. There is no accommodation for low-paid workers. I have user members that are working in companies that are paying appalling level of wages that are part of the survivors, to my shock. So I'm just saying to you that the city needs an emergency mass public housing program to ensure that we build houses on the scale that is required, of tens and hundreds of thousands, to address the housing backlog and to ensure that everybody has a decent accommodation and decent housing in the inner city of Johannesburg, but I think across the whole of the city of Johannesburg, because we are speaking about the tragedy of Usindiso and tragedies in the inner cities. But the reality is flooding, fires, and many other tragedies are a permanent reality in many informal settlements in the city of Johannesburg and across the country, in all the major urban centers where our people are forced to live in conditions of squalor and degradation.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, one part of this report has finally been released, but the story itself is nowhere near over. Mametlwe Sebei, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. We appreciate your reaction to what's unfolded so far. Mametlwe Sebei is the president of the General Industries Workers Union of South Africa.